Hear the word of the Lord this morning, Exodus chapter 20, starting with verse 4. You must not make for yourself an idol of any kind, or an image of anything in the heavens, or on the earth, or in the sea. You must not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, who will not tolerate your affection for any other gods. I lay the sins of the parents upon their children. The entire family is affected, even children in the third and fourth generations of those who reject me. But I lavish unfailing love for 1,000 generations on those who love me and obey my commands. May God add his blessing to the reading of his word. And you are what you eat. Heard that expression, right? In the 1820s, that is attributed to a French physician when they started to realize that the foods that we put into our bodies, affected who we were and how we lived. And we have used that title and that phrase in a number of ways as we have understood more and more through the years that the things that we eat impact our health. They impact our attitudes. They can even impact our emotions or actions. They have these deep consequences on us, all the things that we consume. And that phrase of the last 40 years has grown to mean just more than about what we eat, but it reflects this understanding that the choices that we make impact our lives. The things that I put into my life are what my life becomes. The more I consume of those things, the more my life is filled with those things, the more I become those things. Now, what's interesting is many trace this saying back to the early church. And that some form of this saying began because Christians were talking about taking communion. And that you are what you eat perhaps began as people began to say, if you are consuming the body and the blood of Christ in communion, you should become like Jesus. That you are what you eat in that instance. And so there's this saying from this quote from Greg Beale. He's a biblical scholar. What people revere, they resemble, either for ruin or restoration. We understand that what we put into our mouths influences our body, but what we put into our hearts influences every part of our lives. Our purpose, our meaning, our identity, how we feel about life, how we move forward in life. And we become to resemble what it is that we revere. In looking at the second commitment in Exodus 20 today, where God calls his people into this covenant relationship with them, and he tells them that he doesn't want them to worship any idols, where he doesn't want some image to represent him. What we come to understand is one of the reasons that God does not want that is because he wants his people to be his image to the world. He wants them to resemble him. What we revere, we resemble. And so as we look at our hearts and our lives, we begin to see what it is we really worship when we begin to see what our lives produce. Who we are and how we live, how we talk, how we act. And if Jesus is really at the center of our hearts, our lives resemble him. So let's look at this commandment again. We are looking each week with a few simple questions. Number one, we ask what the commandment is, what it tells us about God, what it tells us about ourselves, and then what it tells us about Jesus, how it points us to him. So what is this commandment? This is very similar to the first commandment that we looked at last week, but here God is talking more about worship. So last week he said, there's no one like me. I'm the only God. There's one God, and it's me. And now he says, I don't want you to worship me in the way that other gods have been worshipped. So first, there's kind of two elements to this. One, I don't want you to worship the wrong elements. Remember, when we talked about the plagues in Egypt, and we talked about how God brought all these plagues, we saw that they were associated with the Egyptian gods. All their gods had some representative in nature, right? From the sun to a bull to all the different animals. They had these representations of themselves, and they would make statues of them. And God is saying, there is nothing in creation that can resemble me. Nothing in that created order that you can look at and say that's what God is like. I'm not the sun, I'm not a bull, I'm none of those things. And so don't use an image like that to represent me. But there also is an element of worship. God desired to be worshipped in a certain way, and he did not want to be worshipped in the ways that the gods of the people around them were worshipped. Moses explains this in Deuteronomy chapter 12. He says this, when you drive out all the nations that live there, you must destroy all the places where they worship their gods, high on the mountains, up on the hills, and under every green tree. Break down their altars, smash their sacred pillars, burn their Asherah poles, and cut down their carved idols. Completely erase the name of their gods. Do not worship the Lord your God in the way these pagan people worship their gods. Rather, you must seek the Lord your God at the place of worship he himself will choose from among the tribes, the place where his name will be honored. There you will bring your burnt offerings, your sacrifices, your tithes, your sacred offerings, your offerings to fulfill a vow, your voluntary offerings, and your offerings of the firstborn animals of your herds and flocks. There you and your families will feast in the presence of the Lord your God, and you will rejoice in all you have accomplished because the Lord your God has blessed you. Your pattern of worship will change. So Moses tells them, when you go into the promised land, you're going to go into a place where there are patterns of worship established. There are places of worship established. And he says, I want you to smash them all. Get rid of them. Drive them out completely. Destroy them. Because God will choose where God is worshipped. And God will choose how God is worshipped. He is in control of that. And so God here tells them he doesn't want them to worship the true God the way that people have worshiped false gods. And so we have this commitment that is God saying, I'm not like the other gods that you've seen around. Not only am I the only God, I don't want you to treat me like you would have treated these other gods. I'm above them, beyond them. I'm unique. That leads us to the next question. What does this teach us about who God is? It teaches us, first, that he is unique. Again, a reminder, the same thing we learned last week. There's no one like him. The same lesson we learned last week, that he is supreme. All glory is due to him. All honor, all praise. He stands above these false gods. He reiterates in this that he is jealous. God uses that term. And we talked about last week how that's often a negative connotation for us. The negative connotation of jealousy is when you are jealous for something that doesn't belong to you. But here, the positive connotation of jealousy is that when you are jealous for something that does belong to you, that's a jealousy that's okay. And so it is, there's a commentator, Christopher Wright, he says, a God who is not jealous would be as contemptible as a husband who doesn't care whether or not his wife was faithful to him. That's what God's jealousy is to us. You're in this covenant relationship with him, and he's not willing to share us with these other gods. He's protecting what is his. That leads us to that next characteristic, that he's faithful. He tells us here that he'd be faithful to generations that have followed him. And then he goes on to say that he loved them. It's the first time God has used those words. And perhaps the first time that that those words have been used about any God in any culture. Love was not a characteristic attached to gods in other countries, in other places. God here, but he tells them, I will love you to 1,000 generations. It's been implied in what he has done, but now he speaks it. He makes that real to them. And this love becomes the very foundation of this covenant relationship that they are establishing with one another. So what does that mean for me, for us? What does it mean for us today? Idolatry is the sin that is most talked about in the Bible, more than any other sin. It's not really close. And we often think about this as, like an Old Testament problem, right? If I put a golden calf down here in front of us, nobody's going to be tempted to bow down to it, right? We wouldn't do what they did. But Ezekiel 14:3 talks about how we set up idols in our hearts. See, idols aren't just these outward things. Idols are these inward things. The things that we put in place of God in our hearts. So let me give you some these quick truths about idols. Number one, anything can be an idol. Number two, everything has been an idol to someone. 3, an idol is anything that fills God's place. 4, an idol is anything you think you cannot live without. Number 5, an idol is anything you hope in and turn to for joy. Number 6, an idol is anything you use to make yourself feel secure or comfortable. Number 7, we make an idol whenever we turn God into something we can control or manipulate. Number 8, we make an idol when we only worship some of God's attributes, but not all of them. And number 9, we make an idol when we worship God the way we want him to be, rather than the way that he is. And so the essence of idolatry becomes we want to be in control of God. We make him in this image. This is what I want God to look like. It might sound silly for us to make God in the image of a calf, but the truth is we take God and we shape him and mold him into who we want him to be all the time. We say, this is how God speaks. This is how God acts. This is how God works. And we decide who God is. That's idolatry. And this commitment to God is us recognize that God never wanted to be represented by a sculpture or a painting, a golden statue. God wanted his image to be seen in his people. He tells his people time and time again, my glory will be known through you. We that are committed to him are his representation here on earth. We are to begin to resemble what we revere. In Psalm 135, the psalmist writes this: the idols of the nations are silver and gold, made by human hands. They have mouths but cannot speak, eyes but cannot see. They have ears but cannot hear, nor is there breath in their mouths. Those who make them will be like them, and so will all who trust in them. Those who make them will be like them. We resemble what we revere. And so when we make our own idols, when we make God in our own image, we begin to resemble that too. And here he says they make gods, they don't have any eyes, ears, mouth, nose. They have no life. So how do we resemble that? Well, he's not talking about physically. He's talking about spiritually. And so when we begin to make these gods in our own image, when we begin to follow these things that are not of God, but that are of our making, we are in this place where we no longer have eyes to see what's true, ears to listen to what God is saying to us. There's no breath. There's no life in it. Just like the things we worship are dead, so our spiritual lives become dead as well. Jeremiah says this in Jeremiah 2:5. What fault did your ancestors find in me that they strayed so far from me? They followed worthless idols and became worthless themselves. You become what you revere. They became worthless. If the things we live for are worthless, if the things we fight for are worthless, if the things we value and find meaning and purpose in are worthless, then what does that say about us? And what do you think we become from that? We hear of people who are struggling, who are hurting, who are incapable of finding peace and purpose in life. And this is why. Because they are looking for worth in worthless things. And until we begin to look for our worth in the only one who is worthy, and the Lamb who was worthy to be slain, it's only then that our lives begin to have the worth, the meaning, the purpose that God intended for us all to have. So how does this talk of idols, how does this point us to Jesus? How do we get to Jesus from here? What, 2 verses. Colossians 1:15 says, Christ is the visible image of the invisible God. John 1:18, no one has ever seen God, but the unique one who is himself God is near to the Father's heart. He has revealed God to us. Jesus was sent to be the visible image of an invisible God. And John tells us that no one has seen God before, but then Jesus came, and now we know what he looks like. So God's people failed in their commitment. They were supposed to be his image to the world, and they failed in that because they continued to follow these idols and find value in these worthless things. And so here we see Jesus comes to give us that image, to show us who God is. We've seen the image of God because we've seen Jesus. And what we see of God in Jesus then is what we worship. We see the sacrifice, we see the love, we see the joy, we see the hope and peace, we see the patience, we see all that we're looking for in the idols that we build. We find all of that and more in Jesus. You should never want to have these other things in your heart because Jesus has shown you why God is the only one who deserves to be there. There's a old sermon by a pastor by the name of David Clarkson. And he talks about how when you talk about idolatry, almost everybody when they first hear it thinks, not my problem. Right? I don't do that. But then said it is the most common sin amongst all people. And that's why Scripture talks about it so much. And he says, in fact, the human heart is a factory that mass produces idols. So he used this image. And the image he uses was this. And it's one I think is helpful for us. He said, I want you to imagine that your whole life is like a house. And every room is a different part of your life. And so, here's a room that's your family. Here's a room that's your job. Here's a room that's school. Here's a room that's your hobbies. Here's a room that's your finances. Every different part has a room. And he said the temptation would be for you to walk through the rooms and try to figure out which room might have an idol in it. But he said that the problem is, if you really went through each room, what you would find is every room is full of idols. That every room and every compartment of our lives has things in them that we have put in the place of God. And so he begins to ask these questions. When we prefer our wisdom to God's wisdom, that's an idol. When we prefer our desires to God's will, that's an idol. When our reputation is more important than God's honor or glory, that's an idol. When a spouse or a child or a friend or a relationship is more important than God, that's an idol. When we are more consumed by our enemies, more troubled by our dangers to our freedom, or things or lives from the world around us, than we are consumed by God, that's an idol. When success or failure to achieve it defines our life and self-worth, that's an idol. And if we begin to ask those questions, he says, in every room, we see that factory. We see that our lives have mass-produced idols. And so, to end today, I've compiled this list of questions. None of these are mine, okay? I'm not taking credit for any of them, but a lot of different pastors, from Tim Keller to Mark Driscoll, J.D. Greer, and many others, this long list of tests that they have used for idolatry. And these are just questions that I want you to prayerfully consider. As you ask them, you begin to start to realize that what idols really look like in our lives. And so I'm going to ask them to you, and I want you to prayerfully think about them. What thing have you sacrificed most for? Who is there in your life that you feel like you can't forgive? What one thing do you most hope is in your future? What one thing do you most worry about losing? If you could change one thing about yourself, what would it be? When do you feel the most significant? Where do you turn for comfort when things are not going well? What triggers depression in you? What do you long for most passionately? What are you most afraid of? What angers you most with others and with God? What makes you happiest? What do you want to have more than anything else? Whose approval are you seeking? What do you want to control or master? What do you treasure most? What do you complain about? What do you habitually think about in your free moments? Where do you spend your money? What emotions are uncontrollable? If your greatest nightmare is uncertainty, then control is your idol. If your greatest nightmare is rejection, then approval is your idol. If your greatest nightmare is stress or demands, then comfort is your idol. If your greatest nightmare is humiliation or embarrassment, power is your idol. So begin to ask all those questions. They are just meant to begin to reveal the things that we value, that we revere, that we worship, that mean the most to us. Those become our gods. And none of them work as our gods. We may have answered all those questions with things that matter, that might be meaningful, that we should love and care for, but none of them should ever be put in the place of our God. They become worthless things that make our life worthless when we put them in His position in our lives. So I'm going to ask the worship team to come forward as we close today. And as we sing today, we're going to sing this familiar song that just talks about how great our God is. How great He is in our lives. So I'm going to end with this quote. A guy by the name of Christopher Wright writes for the Gospel Coalition. And he says this: the worst thing about idols, as the Hebrew Scriptures so tirelessly point out, is that they are utterly useless when you need them the most. They don't work. And so if you're wondering why the things that you're leaning on, that you're trusting in, that you're turning to aren't giving your life what you need, because you're looking for things that only God can give you and things that are not God. So start trusting in Him and in Him alone. Look to the one who has worth for your worth. Look to the one who is great, who is faithful, who does love you, to bring your life meaning and purpose. May we shatter the idols that we brought with us today. As God commanded these people to do. May we break them and allow who God is to determine who we are. To let God decide who we worship, how we worship, where we worship, what our lives and our hearts look like. May He be the one. May His goodness and greatness and faithfulness and love, may that be the one who decides who we are. And may you find your meaning and purpose and worth that He's created in you. You were created in His image. You are meant to be His image to the world around us. So may you be filled with Him today, so that the whole world can see who He is because of what He's done in your life. Let's stand and sing of how great our God is.